Thank you for auditing the Always Positive new music review show hosted by a French professor who has a couple of goofy reasons for reviewing the album Hoffa by Dave East and Harry Fraud. The first reason is that, well, in theory, tomorrow Kanye releases a new album. So I thought it would be kind of a funny joke if my last video before reviewing Kanye West was Dave East. Kind of an East-West bowl thing. Jadinklage Margoon, you know? I don't know. I thought that was kind of funny, but that's not the stupidest reason. The main dumb reason why I want to review this is that I love Jimmy Hoffa, or I'm fascinated by Jimmy Hoffa, primarily because of an amazing movie that was made about his life. And I don't mean that piece of garbage that Scorsese released last year, The Irishman. I mean Danny DeVito's overlooked masterpiece from 1992, Hoffa. Stay tuned to the end of this video where you will see me do imitations of both movies and go on a little bit of a tirade about why the 1992 movie is so good. But why Hoffa? Why is Dave East and why do Dave East and Harry Fraud, why do they decide to use this figure as the center of their album? I mean, in some ways it makes sense, right? He was a powerful figure. If you don't know, he was the person who ran the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, one of the most powerful unions in America. He is responsible for a lot of the labor union success in America in the 20th century. He also was very corrupt. He was in bed with gangsters, spent a lot of time in jail. Very interesting life. He's a good sort of character that shows the relationship between money and power, and he had that influence. So it makes sense, and especially in the fact that he was most active in the 70s, or he's most infamous in the 70s, that's when he disappeared, most active in the 50s and 60s. He ends up being kind of a 70s-ish character, and hip-hop loves figures from the 70s and 80s who have some kind of mystical, underworld, powerful, male presence. Or actually not even male, right? Griselda named themselves after a female drug kingpin, right? But you know, your Tony Montanas and your Freeway Rick Ross, all these figures of the underworld that are so popular, it makes sense that we're just running out. So they found Hoffa. Eventually, some American rapper is going to discover the French bank robber Jacques Messerine, and that is an amazing story. The French rappers have already mined that completely, but there's a lot there for American rappers if they ever find it. But it makes sense that we're going to a 70s style figure because the soundscape here is very consciously 70s. Harry Fraud is one of these producers who's very capable of recreating a kind of dirty, musty sound that is both reminiscent of the 70s and reminiscent of rap in the 90s, imitating the sound of the 70s, that nice kind of grimy feel. Speaking of rap from the 90s, all the way throughout this album, there's so many references to music from the 90s, I actually couldn't keep track. Please put in the comments if I missed any. So far I got Jay-Z, Mace, Andre 3000, P. Diddy, Bone Thugs and Harmony, Jodeci, SWV, and Tony Braxton. And I think there's even more. Now, what is this? Like, what is this album? You know, I'm not just reviewing it because I want to talk about the movie from 1992. It's a very good album, but I think it's one that's pretty easy to sleep on. And I think that's partly because Dave East this is the first time I've ever listened to Dave East, by the way. I mean, I've heard him featuring. But he's sort of he's kind of a contradictory figure. You know, he's I think easy to overlook, but as we'll see, he has a lot of very good verses. He positions himself in a very interesting sort of middle ground in between a lot of different opposing styles, right? Like he has a very aggressive flow, right? Like his voice, he sounds kind of like that register. But at the same time, he's totally relaxed. So he has this like very vicious, biting style, but he always seems totally at ease on the mic. He doesn't seem like nervous or coked up or whatever that kind of feeling is. So I'm not gonna do it. You know, he doesn't get there, right? He seems both kind of underground-minded and mainstream-minded at the same time. I mean, he's talking about crime and talking about traps and selling all that stuff. But he doesn't really seem like, he doesn't fall into any of the sort of trap music pitfalls. He's not boring. He doesn't do any boring triplet flow. He doesn't do any just repetition of the same things. He never feels like he's just going through a crime dictionary on urbandictionary.com and looking up for different terms for dealing crack and just choosing them. It feels like he honestly is just somebody who used to be a criminal and no longer is. Maybe the most interesting contradiction of Dave East as a rapper is his mixture between humble and braggadocious. Like, he talks about how successful he is, but constantly while talking about how unsuccessful he was in the past. For this for this album, I'm just going to call it, he goes between his flosses and his losses. Bars, right? So he flosses a lot and talks about all the money and cars that he has, but at the same time he's very consistent in talking about how things have not always been so easy on him. Harry Fraud is a very competent producer. He produces a lot for Benny the Butcher. Good kind of throwback beats, kind of breezy. He's sort of like, you know, if you did a tier list of like modern alternative rap producers, you know, he's not in your S tier or probably even in your A tier. He's not quite as exciting as Alchemist or Derringer, you know. But he's very, like, especially listening a second time, he has a sort of laid back approach which actually matches the relaxed style of Dave East. So I think it works really quite well. The stamp for the album, which is like the homework that I give you, a song to listen to if you've not heard it, I'm just going to start with the first track, The Disappearance. I'll put a link to it up there. Starts off with a piano and references like news clips of Jimmy Hoffa disappearing. Jimmy Hoffa is also very famous for disappearing. No one knows where he is or where he went. Presumably, he was killed by the mafia and buried in the woods or in Giant Stadium, we don't know. But that's the other aspect of why Hoffa. It could be just that he was gone for a while and he comes back. The production on here is very breezy. It becomes like a saxophone, like comes in and does more work than the piano. The drums come in and then go out. Very kind of delicate dynamics on this song. At one point, he mentions Action Bronson, and actually that reminds me a lot of the whole song. It feels like an Action Bronson song, that kind of breezy yet streetwise feel. He raps the whole way through about his life, about poverty, about flossing and lossing. Flossing and lossing, that doesn't work. About flossing and losing, floosing and loosing. He seems very honest all the way throughout. You know, he talks about it's been a long time since he's sold crack and how he doesn't. Here, I'll give you an example of his lyrics and how good they are. My attitude was passive before I opened up the package, meaning the package of cocaine he was going to sell. Fiend in the living room, high, nodding to Gladys. I seen roaches fall on the toaster before the bread rise. Funny I'm alive, but only concerned with dead guys. So, you know, it's a beautiful image of a roach falling into a toaster. This image of urban poverty is very evocative. It's very, like, feels very real, you know, and he actually, he punctuates it with the word facts, you know, but he's interested in dead guys, I assume, meaning money. And just the whole way through, it's just this, it's all in that kind of register where he's talking about how he trapped to get out of poverty and out of squalor, and then how he's a musician, and it's just a very well done. Like, you could hear that verse, and that wouldn't necessarily have popped out. There's something about his style that requires multiple listening. Maybe he's too subtle for his own good. The next track, another thing I love that he always just says Hoffa. That's how he tags things, because as we will get into, I love thinking about Hoffa. 60 for the Lawyer. So that's the next track, and again it starts off with the opening to a Dick Cavett Show interview with Jimmy Hoffa. You can find this on YouTube. I found it on YouTube. There's no Dave East fans there, so go there and say, I'm here for Dave East. It's a fascinating interview with Jimmy Hoffa. Very complicated guy. Again, an interesting hero and villain at the same time. And on the second listen, I just came to really enjoy this song so much. Just the laid-back feel. He has a very kind of, like, sort of affable personality. Like, he says at one point, you ain't got to sneeze for me to bless you. It's just kind of a gracious line. He doesn't seem angry or vicious. He seems fairly good-natured and kind. And again, it is worth watching the entire Dick Cavett interview with Jimmy Hoffa, although his take on homosexuality in prisons is a bit archaic, to put it nicely. Next track is called Diamonds, very Kanye-esque, West, East, a very Kanye-esque sample. Oh, and please put in your comments, what is your favorite name from the East-West Bowl? Why not? I think mine is Torque Lewis. So that this great, like, Kanye voice is sampled. I mean, not Kanye, but a sample like Kanye where it's pitched up. Again, talking about the life of a crack dealer, a good example of his style of lyrics. Had a cousin who overdosed when Diddy put out Benjamins, right? One of these 90s rap references. Dog food syringes by the benches from the trenches trying to get a chain. Heard all them stories about how they lynched us, now they trying to hang. ARs from labels trying to find the gang. You can search for Google for a year, you'll never find my pain. So think about the breadth of that verse, just how he starts off talking about people he knows who died of drugs, talks about what it was like sitting on the benches and people trying to die, talking about the history of lynching by white Americans of African Americans, and then all of a sudden we get into A&Rs and people, culture vultures from record labels trying to like jump in, and that they couldn't possibly find who he really is because they couldn't really find his pain. Just Another Rapper, maybe a little bit fast, like he changes up the style, it's nice. He has kind of a little bit of faster style here. There's a Juvenile reference. Another 90s rapper. You were just about to type it in, I could tell. Go Off is one of my favorite beats on the album. It actually reminds me of like a slowed down version of Run This Town, speaking of Kanye, because it's a guitar-based beat. And there's just not that many hip-hop songs based on guitar samples, right? Like you want bass or you want drums, and if guitar is there, it's sort of secondary. Here, it feels very forward. I like this G Herbo, who's featured on here. He has kind of a different voice that's also quite difficult to place, which makes him a good companion for Dave East. Uncle Rick is a terrible lost opportunity. Apparently, this is based on a true story about his relative, Dave East's uncle, who was in jail for 40 years and then exonerated. So the criminal justice system is broken. We know it. There's not a question. Like, is it broken? There's no question. It's broken. It highly it's a highly racist system that perpetually puts down African Americans in our country. And here we have an actual example of it happening in a concrete way, and he just doesn't go into it. He just mentions it. I don't know. Maybe I'm just a professor who wants an entire song about his Uncle Rick and about the injustice so that I can play it and feel better about myself and act like I'm doing something when I'm not. I don't know what it is. But I do wish it went a little bit more. Fortunately, Benny the Butcher is on here, which made me feel a lot better about everything because he's so great when he is a guest appearance. I still don't always feel that his solo albums, he's able to carry everything. I find his voice maybe a little bit too bland on its own, but just a great verse here from him. The product is the album takes a weird turn here. It's like a kind of a softer 80s feel, like a softer 80s beat, kind of fast style rapping. I do like here though, he talks about making a lot of money off of ganja, off of selling marijuana. And I feel like this is a real thing, and I don't really care about authenticity, right? I talk about it all the time on the channel. Who am I to say what's authentic and what's not, But I like the idea of talking about being able to make money selling weed instead of selling coke. That just feels like a very real thing that happens a lot, and just talking about what his life was. Money or Power has a great sample from Jimmy Hoffa talking about the importance of having power instead of having money. A nice kind of 70s sample in here, very kind of funky and cool song. I Can Hear the Storm is probably my favorite song on the album. He remembers his life. He's got this really great, this is definitely the best production by Harry Fraud on here. This keyboard lead, this like weird, ethereal, faraway keyboard lead that goes on here. And some storm sounds in the back. A funny line about, we cut up squares like we're Sicilian, a reference to Sicilian pizza, which, do you ever feel like Sicilian pizza is like always a disappointment? Except at Pinocchio's. There's a place called Pinocchio's that has good, but I always feel like I want it to be better. Dolla and a Dream is just not a good song. I don't know. I'm sorry to say. There's too much singing going on here, kind of weird auto-tune. It's a soft beat. As a Celtics fan, I appreciate the reference to Len Bias, but it doesn't make up for kind of a weak chorus. That's all right. Count It Up, the next song with French Montana. Another song with kind of a soft chorus, but just a better one. I really like the keyboard and the piano style. They're trying to fade us with the quarantine. I don't know what that means, but an interesting COVID lyric. Then we get to The Win, which has kind of another 80s light beat, cool horn sample loop that gets cut off. I like this. Harry Fraud's getting a little bit more adventurous with this by cutting off the beat. I really like the chorus about how you have to lose to win. And again, this whole concept of flossing and losing, that just goes back over and over again. Lots of love for his producer, Harry. Really great lyrics. Here's one of my favorite examples of how he's constantly referring back to his youth and the desperation of poverty. But not just that, like about a difficult family life. Every obstacle I faced just made me great. Arguments before my classes every morning made me late. You know? So like that's what I'm telling you. You can sleep on this album, but it's filled with these little nuggets of interesting lyrics, you know? The idea of like getting in fights at, like I assume at breakfast or something in the morning, and you're being late for school, and then you're late for school, and the students and the teachers think that you're not a serious student, and you kind of get set back, and maybe the cycle is continuing, is perpetuated out of things that you can't control. All that's implied in this one line. Yeah, I know, it's a great minimalist beat, really nice chorus, more the trap to rap theme, very at ease. The best example of the relaxed and aggressive style of Dave East. The album ends with the song Red Fox Restaurant, a cool opening sample talking about the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, and a nice sort of, I would call it a cocktail piano loop that's going on here. A very kind of like woozy, nice piano loop. So why Hoffa? I don't know. At one point he refers to like his plug being like Hoffa, maybe he's Hoffa, maybe he's disappeared. I think primarily it's this idea of him being a powerful person who's a hero and a villain. So, I said I'd talk about the movies. So here's my brief movie moment, okay? I love Scorsese, okay? Casino is one of my 5 favorite movies of all time, okay? I just rewatched it, it's great. But The Irishman is just really long and not good. And the acting is terrible. And the depiction of Jimmy Hoffa is not very interesting. The movie from 1992, directed by Danny DeVito, a very underrated director, Death to Smoochie, War of the Roses. He's done a lot of really interesting movies, you know. And Hoffa. So it's directed by DeVito, written by David Mamet, one of the most famous playwrights of the 20th century. It stars a very young John C. Reilly playing a straight role. He's just great. It's a funny, smart, dark movie that goes to the heart of what makes Jimmy Hoffa both a hero and a villain. It really gets you into his life and his mind. Jack Nicholson won the Oscar that year. He did. He won it for A Few Good Men. An inferior movie with an inferior plot, with just a basic morality tale that really isn't that interesting. It's mostly about like, what is hierarchy and what do we find? Jack Nicholson himself said that Hoffa was his best performance. That he should have won for Hoffa and not for that. But this is the thing. He was just too subtle in the movie Hoffa from 1992. His performance was too good. He wasn't yelling and doing his angry thing that he does so well. He was just being this mythical figure and actually embodying it quite well. Now you compare that with Al Pacino, who goes in and out of the Jimmy Hoffa accent. You know, Jimmy Hoffa had kind of a weird nasally way of talking, and having a sort of a Midwest accent. I don't do it that well. But Pacino would go between trying to do that and his normal thing. So I'm going to do an impersonation of Pacino doing Hoffa. I'm going to read a famous quote from Jimmy Hoffa. In the old days, all you needed was a handshake. Nowadays, you need 40 lawyers. This is how Al Pacino would read that as Jimmy Hoffa. In the old days, all you needed was a handshake. Nowadays, you need 40 lawyers! Hooah! That is his acting performance, and he almost won an Oscar for it. Now here's my impersonation of Danny DeVito's character talking to Jack Nicholson's character in the beginning of the movie Hoffa. Hey, Jimmy, you want a cup of coffee? No. Thank you. That's the subtlety and the brilliance of the movie Hoffa. All right, enough of that. I don't think anyone's watching this at this point, and I really hurt my throat doing my impersonation of that terrible Al Pacino Hoffa. But you know, I've thought about doing a movie channel here, but I just don't have enough time. So I'll have to get in where I can get it. Okay, well hopefully this weekend is Kanye time. Until then, do check out the Dave East album, okay? I think you might discover things in it that are really quite good. And it's a good selection for Thunderground Thursday. All right, there's the camera.